Now, imagine this. A simple bank visit turns into a high-stakes battle of wits, where a seasoned bank teller and her manager make a huge mistake in judging a customer. What happens when they treat Clint Eastwood like just another guy off the street? Let's just say, things don't go as they expected. Stick around to find out how this unexpected encounter teaches a lesson no one saw coming. Before we dive into the story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. The bank was unusually quiet for a Thursday afternoon. The dull hum of fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound in the otherwise peaceful lobby. The occasional shuffle of papers and the soft clink of a pen tapping against the counter were the only reminders that life still went on in the world outside. The atmosphere was almost serene, until Clint Eastwood walked in. He entered with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from decades of life lived on his own terms. His worn leather jacket, the kind that had seen better days but still carried a certain rugged charm, seemed to tell the story of someone who didn't care for the latest fashions. His jeans, slightly faded but well-fitted, completed the look of a man who didn't seek attention. Yet it was undeniable that everyone in the room noticed him the moment he stepped in. He moved with purpose, not hurried but deliberate. The few patrons sitting in the waiting area glanced up momentarily, their eyes catching on him before quickly looking away. But none of them recognized him, not yet at least. Clint Eastwood wasn't the kind of man who stood out in a crowd, but something about him made people stop and think twice. Clint approached the counter, his boots clicking softly on the marble floor. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a check and slid it across the counter with an almost practiced motion. His movements were slow, measured, the kind that only someone used to having the world on their terms could make. The young bank teller, Jessica, looked up from her computer screen, briefly glancing at him through her glasses. She wasn't quite sure what to make of him at first. His face was lined, weathered from years of experience, but there was nothing extraordinary about it. He could have been anyone. Yet, something in his presence told her he was no average customer. "How can I help you today, sir?" Jessica asked, her voice friendly but professional, masking the slight unease she felt. She didn't quite know why, but there was something about this man that made her hesitate. Clint didn't answer her with words. Instead, he simply slid the check across the counter. His face remained neutral, betraying no emotion as he let the check rest in front of her. His demeanor was calm, almost deliberately unremarkable, an act of humility, or perhaps a shield to protect his privacy. Jessica's polite smile faltered just slightly as her eyes shifted down to the check. The amount written on it made her stomach tighten. It was more than she had ever seen on a personal check in her 2 years working behind this counter. She quickly looked back at Clint, her fingers tapping nervously on the surface of the counter, betraying the unease she was feeling. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice shaky now. She forced a smile, trying to mask the unease creeping in. "May I see your ID?" Clint's eyes narrowed just slightly, the only visible sign of recognition that something wasn't quite right. He didn't speak, didn't offer a word of protest, but his gaze sharpened, a flicker of something there beneath the surface. Annoyance? Suspicion? Hard to tell. Without a word, Clint nodded and reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing the edge of his wallet. The movements were slow, measured, never rushed. It wasn't as if he was doing this for her sake. It was more like he was complying with an unspoken rule that had been set in place, but he wasn't about to make it easy. Not for her. Jessica's fingers continued to tap on the counter as she waited, eyes flicking between Clint's calm face and the check lying before her. As she stared at the amount on the check, a sense of unease began to creep into her thoughts. Something didn't sit right. This didn't feel like the usual kind of transaction. In her gut, she knew something was off, something more than just the check. Her instincts were screaming at her that this wasn't just another customer. Jessica's hand shook slightly as she reached for the ID Clint had handed over. She glanced at it quickly. There was nothing too unusual about it, a standard driver's license, the kind she had seen hundreds of times. The name on it read Clint Eastwood, but that meant nothing to her. To Jessica it was just another ID, just another person. She looked back at the check still sitting in front of her. Her gaze lingered on the amount written in bold numbers. This was more money than most people in this town would ever see in a lifetime. The number alone sent a ripple of doubt through her mind. She forced a smile and looked back at Clint, trying to ignore the small voice telling her to be cautious. "Thank you, sir," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I'll just need to verify a few things and we'll have this processed right away." Clint said nothing. His eyes remained steady, fixed on her as if he was watching her every move. It was as though he knew she wasn't comfortable with the situation, and he didn't say a word to ease her nerves. Jessica's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing. Something didn't add up. He had handed her a check that clearly came from a large account, but the ID didn't match up with anyone she had seen in the system. She'd never seen such a large amount processed before, not for someone who looked so ordinary. Her fingers tapped hesitantly at the keys, searching the system for the account. The screen flickered before her eyes, but all she could focus on was the man in front of her. There was a certain calm about him, a quiet authority. Finally, after a moment of hesitation, she asked, "I'll just need a bit more information to confirm the details. Could you tell me your address as it appears in the system?" Clint's eyes didn't flinch. He didn't react, didn't show any sign of frustration. He simply stared at her, the lines around his eyes deepening as if he were considering her request. Jessica's fingers trembled slightly as she entered the request into the system. She could feel the weight of Clint's stare, the quiet tension building between them. Each keystroke felt like it was taking forever. What was she missing? The system hummed to life, a loading bar slowly ticking forward. The seconds felt like minutes. Her palms were sweaty, and her mind was already racing through the possible scenarios. She couldn't help but wonder if she was being too cautious. But no. Something about Clint Eastwood, this man standing in front of her, made her doubt everything she thought she knew about banking procedures. "Sir," she said after a moment of silence, trying to sound as professional as possible, "I just want to confirm that this check is legitimate. It's not something we encounter every day." Clint remained silent, his gaze unwavering. But in his eyes, Jessica could see something almost daring. It was as though he were waiting for her to figure it out, but also testing her. His patience was unnerving. And that only made Jessica more uneasy. The tension between them was palpable. She couldn't help but feel like she was losing control of the situation, and that made her defensive. She pressed on, trying to sound firm. "I'll just need to verify a few more things, sir." But the words didn't sound as confident as she wanted them to. They felt weak, like a desperate attempt to stall. She had no idea why, but there was something about this transaction that made her question everything she thought she knew about her job. Clint's lips twitched ever so slightly, as if he were aware of the internal struggle playing out inside her. But he didn't break. He didn't speak. The room felt too small now. Her stomach churned and her mind raced. There was only one thing left to do: escalate. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Jessica's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the clacking of her nails against the plastic the only sound in the otherwise quiet space. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. Her pulse quickened as the seconds ticked by. She glanced once more at Clint, whose steady gaze never wavered. It was unnerving. His calm was almost too much to bear, especially when everything inside her was telling her that something wasn't right. Her breath caught in her throat, and she quickly glanced at the monitor again, hoping to find some answer, some sign that she wasn't about to make a huge mistake. But nothing. The system was slow, unhelpful, and the figures still weren't adding up. It was time for backup. Jessica's heart raced as she called out to the back office, her voice strained. Daniel? Could you come here for a second?" Daniel, the bank manager, appeared from the hallway a moment later. He was in his mid-30s, confident, with a somewhat cocky air about him. He was used to being in charge, and his quick stride across the floor reflected that. But when he noticed Jessica's flustered expression and the tension in the air, his confidence faltered. "What's going on?" Daniel asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and mild concern as he approached the counter. His eyes flicked toward Clint, who was still standing there, his demeanor unchanged. I just need to double-check this check," Jessica explained, trying to sound more composed than she felt. "There's something off about it, and I haven't been able to get the details to line up in the system." Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly confused. He glanced at the check for the first time. Then, his gaze shifted to Clint, who stood there with an almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. Without a word, Daniel leaned over to the computer and began typing. His fingers moved with the practiced precision of someone who had worked in banking for years, but even as the minutes ticked by, there was a noticeable tension in his posture. Jessica stood to the side, trying to steady her nerves. She had made the call for help, but now she couldn't help but feel small, as though she was being judged. She couldn't understand why Clint was still so calm. If it were anyone else, anyone who hadn't caused this much confusion, Jessica would have already moved past this point, no hesitation, no questions. But this man, there was something about him that unsettled her. "So what's the issue?" Daniel finally asked, his voice sounding a little more impatient. "Everything looks good on my end. What's taking so long? Jessica swallowed, her voice almost a whisper now. There's something about this transaction that's bothering me. The check size. It's a lot more than we usually see here. And the account's not matching up in the system. Daniel leaned over, scanning the screen with a frown. Then he turned toward Clint. Sir, he began, his voice tinged with professionalism, but beneath it, a hint of condescension. Could you please provide the account details? Just so we can speed this process up. Clint finally spoke, his voice low and even. I gave you the check and my ID. That should be enough. His words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Jessica flinched, but Daniel pressed on, his tone now taking on a more authoritative edge. Look, sir, I understand, but we have protocol here. We need to confirm everything is in order before we process such a large amount. This is standard procedure. The subtle insult in Daniel's voice was evident. He wasn't just asking for confirmation anymore. He was suggesting that Clint wasn't following the rules. Jessica, watching it all unfold, felt a rush of sympathy for Clint, but she couldn't afford to be emotional. She needed to stay professional. Clint's eyes flicked between Daniel and Jessica, not breaking his calm composure. The silent tension that had built up between them was now palpable. The room seemed to shrink around them as the power dynamics shifted. Jessica was no longer in control, and Daniel, despite his position, was starting to seem less certain by the second. Jessica could feel her face heating up. She hadn't expected this situation to escalate. She had hoped to handle it on her own, but now, with Daniel involved, it seemed like everything was spiraling out of her control. The worst part? Clint had said nothing. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't reacted in any dramatic way. He was still there, unbothered, as if this were just another day for him. It was then that Daniel's hands froze on the keyboard. The screen flashed, and a new line of information appeared. His eyes widened. He glanced again at the check, then back at Clint. His fingers stilled, and the confident air around him wavered for the first time. Hold on, Daniel said, his voice now shaky. Let me double-check something. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment that everything would change. The seconds dragged on as Daniel sat frozen, staring at the screen in disbelief. His fingers hovered uncertainly over the keyboard, and the room seemed to close in around him. The tension was thick, almost unbearable, as if every sound, every movement, was magnified. Jessica stood off to the side, her hands still gripping the counter, her eyes shifting between Daniel and Clint. Clint hadn't moved an inch. He stood there, unperturbed, his hands loosely folded in front of him, waiting. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in front of him. There was something about the way he stood there, his posture as steady as ever, that made it clear he wasn't worried. It was as though he knew exactly what was coming. Jessica could feel her palms sweating as the moments ticked by. This wasn't just a typical customer. This wasn't some run-of-the-mill transaction. Something was happening here, something she couldn't quite grasp. And now, with Daniel stammering and fumbling over the keyboard, it was clear, they were all in uncharted territory. Daniel's eyes darted from the screen to Clint, then back again. He blinked once, twice, as if the numbers on the screen were a trick of his tired eyes. There must be some mistake, Daniel muttered under his breath. This can't be right. Jessica took a step forward, her voice a mere whisper, as if afraid to speak too loudly. What's wrong? Daniel didn't answer her right away. His eyes were still glued to the screen, scanning the information that had just appeared. He clicked on a few more tabs, trying to make sense of what was in front of him. But the numbers didn't lie. The balance in Clint's account was astronomical, far beyond anything Jessica had seen in her time at the bank. There were no discrepancies, no signs of fraud, nothing that would indicate this wasn't exactly what it appeared to be. The account had been verified. The funds were available. It was all legitimate. The balance was just too much for him to believe. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat and looked up, his voice low, almost apologetic. I'm sorry, sir, he said, his tone now filled with a strange mix of awe and embarrassment. I didn't realize, this account, this check, it's all in order. Jessica's stomach churned as she processed the revelation. The account belonged to Clint Eastwood. It was real. It wasn't some mistake, some glitch in the system. The man standing before her had just handed over a check for an amount that was enough to make anyone stop and take notice. Clint's lips curled into a small, knowing smile, just enough to let them both know he had been aware of this moment all along. He hadn't been nervous, hadn't fidgeted or asked questions, hadn't even raised an eyebrow when they demanded further proof. He had let them twist in the wind, and now the truth was out. He finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost casual. "Is that good enough for you?" Daniel, his confidence now shattered, cleared his throat and nodded, his face reddening. "Yes, of course, Mr. Eastwood. We'll get this processed right away." Jessica could feel the blood rush to her cheeks as she stood there, her mind racing. She wanted to apologize, to say something, anything, to make up for the uncomfortable situation, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was nod weakly and hope that Clint wouldn't hold this against her. Clint, however, didn't seem interested in drawing things out. He simply glanced at the check again, then back at the two of them and nodded curtly. "You'll find everything in order." Without another word, he turned, his boots clicking softly on the tile as he walked toward the door. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the bank, almost louder than it should have been. Every eye in the room seemed to follow him, but Clint didn't care. He moved with the effortless authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. As he reached the door, he paused just for a moment, glancing back at Jessica and Daniel, who were still standing there, frozen in place. Then, with a slight smile, Clint spoke one last time. "Better luck next time," he said, his voice cool and cutting, a perfect punctuation to the uncomfortable silence that had enveloped the bank. And just like that, he was gone. The door swung shut with a soft chime, and the air in the bank seemed to shift. The tension that had filled the room dissipated, but it left behind a thick, awkward silence. Jessica and Daniel stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where Clint had just been. They were both too stunned to speak, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy between them. Jessica's hands were still pressed against the counter, but her fingers were now trembling. She could feel the heat rise in her face as her mind replayed everything. The questioning, the doubt, the way they had treated him as though he were just another suspicious customer. Now she felt small. She felt foolish. Her gaze flicked to Daniel, but he wasn't much better off. His usual confidence had been shattered, replaced by something that resembled embarrassment. His shoulders slumped, and his hands were still resting awkwardly on the edge of the counter, as if he didn't quite know what to do with them anymore. "Daniel, what just happened?" Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper, her words thick with disbelief. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts, but it was clear he was struggling. The reality of the situation was settling in. He had just made an enormous mistake, one that had been so avoidable. He had underestimated Clint Eastwood. Not just the man, but his ability to handle the entire situation with a calmness that had made both of them look unprofessional. Daniel started, his voice trailing off. "I didn't realize." He looked at the floor, shaking his head. "I didn't realize who he was. The account, everything, was real, but it's just so much bigger than anything I've dealt with here." Jessica nodded numbly, her stomach still twisting. "We both judged him," she said, her voice tinged with guilt. We assumed he was just some guy trying to scam us. And we treated him like that." Daniel sighed heavily, his hand running through his hair as he turned to face her. "I've been managing this branch for over 5 years, Jessica. I've seen a lot, but I've never had to question something like that before. I've never had to deal with an account that big. I should have known better though. I should have trusted the process. But I let myself get caught up in the presentation." Jessica felt the sting of his words, but she knew he was right. They had both let appearances cloud their judgment. They had made assumptions based on Clint's unassuming appearance, his quiet demeanor, and hadn't taken the time to see beyond that. "I shouldn't have asked him for his ID like that," she murmured, her voice laced with regret. "I shouldn't have doubted him." "You weren't the only one," Daniel said, his tone softer now, more understanding. "I did the same thing. I pushed him. I questioned him. And for what? Just because I couldn't wrap my head around something that seemed too good to be true?" He ran a hand down his face, clearly frustrated with himself. "We both learned a hard lesson today." There was a long pause. Neither of them spoke for a moment as the realization settled in. They had been quick to judge, quick to question, quick to assume. And in the process they had made a man, the Clint Eastwood, feel small, invisible. The irony of it was not lost on either of them. Finally, Daniel let out a deep breath. I bet he knew this was going to happen. I bet he knew exactly how we'd react. And yet he stayed calm. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just let us dig ourselves into a hole." He paused, letting that thought sink in. Jessica nodded slowly, the weight of it all finally hitting her. Clint had played the situation perfectly. He had known the check would be questioned. He had known they'd try to prove him wrong. And he hadn't even flinched. His silence had been a powerful response, one that left them both looking foolish. "That was a lesson for us," Jessica said quietly, almost to herself. A lesson in humility. Daniel's shoulders sagged, his voice dropping to a whisper. Yeah, it sure was. There was a heavy silence that followed, but it was different now. It wasn't filled with tension or doubt anymore, but with the uncomfortable realization that they had been in the wrong. And the weight of that knowledge wasn't easy to shake off. Jessica took one last look at the door through which Clint had exited, his quiet confidence still lingering in the air like a shadow. She knew she would never forget this moment. She would never forget how they had underestimated him, how she had doubted him, because now, more than ever, she understood the true meaning of respect and trust. Do you think he'll come back? Jessica asked softly, her eyes still fixed on the door. Daniel looked up, and for the first time since Clint had walked out, he allowed himself a small smile, though it was tinged with a hint of humility. I think he already got what he came for, he said. And I think he'll be just fine. With that, they both turned and headed back to their duties, but the lesson they had learned would stay with them forever. The door swung shut with a soft chime, signaling Clint's departure, and the bank lobby was left in an eerie silence. The usual hum of fluorescent lights felt almost deafening now, as if the world outside had continued on, leaving them behind in the quiet aftermath. Jessica and Daniel stood there for a moment, still processing everything that had just happened. The weight of their mistake hung heavily in the air. As the minutes ticked by, Jessica felt the sting of her own embarrassment slowly ebb away, replaced by a lingering sense of clarity. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable in her role as a bank teller. And yet, it wasn't just about the mistake anymore, it was about the lesson she had learned. She had learned not to judge a person by their appearance, not to assume anything based on surface-level impressions. Clint had played the game expertly, showing her that calmness and confidence could often speak louder than words ever could. So what now? Jessica finally asked, breaking the silence. She turned to Daniel, her voice tentative but earnest. What do we do with this lesson? Daniel, still standing a few feet away, had been deep in thought. His brow furrowed as he processed the entire situation once more. He let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping slightly in defeat, but then he squared them again, determination replacing the discomfort that had taken over him moments before. You know, Daniel said slowly, I've been managing this bank for years, but I've never had a wake-up call like this before. We always think we know it all, right? We think we can read people, figure out who's real and who's not. But sometimes we miss the obvious. Jessica nodded, her eyes downcast for a moment, her mind replaying the whole scene. I can't believe I treated him that way, she said quietly, her voice filled with regret. I made assumptions about him just because he didn't look like what I thought a person with that kind of money would look like. I judged him for not fitting some kind of image. Daniel gave her a sympathetic glance. We both did. We both made the same mistake. But what matters now is that we learn from it. Jessica sighed deeply, trying to push past the lingering discomfort. She had already felt the sting of the situation in the moment Clint had walked out. But now, as time passed, she could sense the shift in her perspective. It wasn't just about Clint, it was about them, about how easily people could be written off when others didn't understand who they really were. It wasn't enough to look at a person and decide who they were based on their outward appearance. It was about the deeper story, the one that was never obvious at first glance. Yeah, Jessica said, her voice firmer now. We've learned a lot today. There was a long pause as they both reflected on the experience. It was an uncomfortable, humbling moment, one that neither of them would ever forget. But the real lesson wasn't in how Clint had been treated, it was in the way he handled the situation. He had been calm, unflinching, and composed. Even when faced with doubt, even when questioned unfairly, he had responded with grace and quiet confidence. Jessica glanced at Daniel, her expression thoughtful. Do you think he'll ever come back? She asked softly, almost to herself. Daniel didn't answer right away. He simply looked at the door where Clint had exited moments earlier. I don't know. But if he does, I hope we'll be ready for him. Ready to treat him like we would treat any other customer, with respect. The truth of his words hung in the air. They both knew that if Clint ever returned, they wouldn't make the same mistake again. There was a newfound respect between them now, a respect for each other's roles in the bank and for the customers they served. For Jessica, the encounter with Clint had shifted something deep within her. It wasn't just a lesson about customer service, it was a lesson about human nature. How easily people could be misjudged. How everyone had a story that wasn't always obvious at first glance. And how, sometimes, the quietest people had the most to teach. She turned back to the counter, her mind still reeling with the implications of the day. But she knew one thing for sure. She would never again assume she knew someone's worth based on how they looked. Thanks, Daniel, Jessica said, her voice now steady and sincere. For being understanding. Daniel gave her a small, reassuring smile. Of course. We all make mistakes, Jess. It's how we learn from them that matters. And with that, the two of them got back to work. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the lesson from Clint Eastwood remained in their minds. It had been an ordinary afternoon until it hadn't. And in that quiet, unassuming moment, they had both learned something far greater than they ever could have anticipated.